The Global Quran, a Dynamic Comprehension, a Human Perspective. Chapter 1, The Cow, Part 5, Distortions in the Quranic Descriptions. Dedicated to the Blessed. Briefing to Chapter 1. This chapter of the Quran signifies the characteristics of people based on which the Quran calls them the Blessed or the Disgraced. The two categories are symbolized by examples taken from Bani Israel, who appear to be the descendants of Prophet Yaqub or Jacob. Their descendants were later segregated into nations of other prophets following Yaqub. This chapter talks about those who were dishonest and played tricks with their prophets by distorting the commands of God in the divine books they had, then used religion as the most powerful tool to control people's minds. Review of Parts 1 to 4. These sections describe the Blessed as people who closely followed and instituted God's commands to establish a learned and civilized society, setting justice and accountability for everyone, without discrimination. They have been depicted to manifest God in terms of excellence and scholarship, and by sharing their blessings, they alleviate the disadvantaged. People contrary to the Blessed do the opposite and are termed as the Disgraced. The example of Bani Israel can be extended to all those who drifted away from their books or their prophetic leadership due to their greed for power. These are the major attributes of corruption in a society. Unlimited desires lead to attaining unlimited power, creating injustice and promoting oppression and poverty. This is identical to what Buddha, Jesus, and Moses' 10 Commandments had advocated. Islam came as a resurrection of the human values that had been distorted by the corrupt followers of previous books. This was the biggest challenge faced by Prophet Muhammad. Introduction to Part 5, verses 97 to 121. Understanding Distortions. In these verses, the Prophet has been advised to communicate to people that the divine books, such as the Quran, only presented universal truths, with clear guidelines to those who believe in truthful and factual learning. For them, the Quran is called a good news, as it is meant to satisfy their urge for the originality and divinity of laws that are universally true. They don't dispute about how the message was delivered and who delivered it. They focus on what is delivered, the facts. Disputing over angels and messengers rather than comprehending the facts would show either the lack of thoughtfulness or bad intentions and character. Showing resistance in understanding a scripture in terms of its philosophy is termed as dishonesty and disloyalty in the Quran. Bani Israel showed this by negating their own books when the prophets referred to something from their own scriptures. They used this trick to gradually distort the originality of God's messages in later editions. There is a warning that anyone following their pathways must be ready to face consequences, which predicts that such tricks could happen in all eras with all scriptures. Those who defy or distort facts are called offenders in the Quran. This term has been used with the description that they not only disregard God's commands, they rather miscommunicate them using knowledge in a distorted way. Examples have been given from the past where people learned deception and scamming tricks in the name of knowledge. These scams could be as small as splitting couples or families, or as large as breaking states. Again, such scammers are guaranteed to exist in all times and will pay for selling their souls. An example has been given from the time of Prophet Suleiman or Solomon, and how his leadership was weakened by applying and presenting such tricks using the scriptures. The Quran has explicitly called it spying within God's messages. It has also been cautioned that such tricks damage the people themselves, and no one could benefit from such deeds, emphasizing that people have no idea how beneficial it would be for them if they followed the actual message instead, for the good. Another example has been given of people around Prophet Muhammad who distorted the phrases heard from him, then justified themselves, saying that they might have misheard him. It has been argued that if someone claimed to be a follower of the Prophet, they must have thoughtfully paid attention to what he could have said rather than misinterpreting his words. If they didn't understand something, they could have questioned appropriately to clarify before spreading it. They should have shown respect for him like learners rather than distorting his words like hypocrites. They would neither bless themselves nor would they want the faithful to be blessed by God. There are changes made by God. It has also been claimed in this part that the Quran carried some updates to the previous scriptures. It explains how to differentiate between distortions made by evil forces and changes made by God. For the latter case, people are advised that if God discards or disregards a previous message, it is updated or is replaced with something similar or more beneficial to the whole of mankind. There can't be any changes from God that benefit some and not others. Hence, people were advised not to make nonsense demands to the Prophet, the way people made to Prophet Musa. It has been further added that the purpose of such demands that the Prophet would not fulfill was to convert believers to non-believers. Another trick. It has been explained that there are people from within the believers who play such tricks out of their cunningness. God advises to ignore their tricks until a verdict is issued for them, assuring that a mechanism is devised for the consequences to occur in due course of time. People are advised to protect themselves from such cunningness by closely following the Prophet's character, institutionalizing this behavior, staying organized, and paying their taxes as instructed by the Prophet. Whatever they do will return to them as part of God's mechanism, who knows everything. Criticizing other religions is a distortion. It has been mentioned that Jews and Christians had claimed that no one can go into paradise except themselves, but they couldn't prove their claim. They could only criticize each other. Jews said, Christian faith has no foundations, and Christians said, Jews' beliefs are baseless, although they both had books that had a common foundation. Yet, they talked as if they were unaware of this message in their respective books. Such people have been assured to be accountable for the religious differences they created this way, distorting God's messages. The Quran calls such people oppressors for creating discriminations and stopping people from praying at each other's places of worship in order to keep the places deserted. People are asked not to pay attention to them. They even discriminate about methods of prayers like turning right or left to face God. It has been clarified that wherever one faces, God will be there. God's presence is not confined in directions and spans all spaces. Similarly, for those who believe that God has a son, are advised to know that God is free of biological relationships and requirements. It is further asserted that God is the divine creator and does not need any social or emotional support to exist, survive, or create anything. When God intends for something to occur, it complies. Demanding a direct conversation with God is called ignorance. The Quran says that we have made our existence obvious through our creations. Knowledgeable people recognize it. For people who lack knowledge but follow our messengers will realize the truth and will be rewarded. Negators and hypocrites are warned that messengers are only to convey the message and won't be responsible for their acts. People have also been warned that if they don't stick to the originality of guidance in the divine books as conveyed by the messengers, they shall lose the care and patronage, as Bani Israel did. God strengthens those who study and follow the guidebook as it ought to be studied and followed, with understanding. Those who defy and distort it shall be the losers. Conclusion. This section of Chapter 1 explains how one can identify distortions in God's messages. The first anomaly would be deviation from universal truth and facts. Hence, it can be argued that if there is anything that is not a universal truth or cannot be identified as a fact, does not present an original message of God, it has been distorted. Secondly, it has been pointed out in these verses that distortion is also created by using the commandments of God irrationally to form weak and unjustified systems that create congestion in people's lives and eventually fail. People who are not educated enough to have deeper analytical skills believe everything said in the name of religion, and a chaos is created. The distorters know the language of the scriptures and are perceived as true believers and scholars. They also have authority to train people, which gives them a position in society where they can easily control ignorant people's minds. Dr. Murtaza Mutahari has mentioned in multiple writings that such people existed in all times. He's categorized them in 3 types. Firstly, gazetted scholars, who skipped the verses for which they did not find supporting Sunnah, which is the collection of the Prophet's words or acts as described by people. Secondly, literal scholars, who explain the Quranic verses by literal meanings. They did not comprehend it with reasoning. And finally, Ismaili and Sufi writers, who used and explained the Quran according to their interests with clear distortions in its concepts. It is mentioned in these verses that there were people who misheard Prophet Muhammad and spread his words untruthfully. Hence, the collections of Sunnah are likely to contain some narrations that were not actually said by the Prophet. This is shown in many examples from those collections that show discrepancies in the Sunnah. For instance, the Prophet's address at the occasion of his last pilgrimage. Particularly his phrase about what he is leaving behind after his death for his followers. This phrase is described below, referring to different books that are considered as authentic sources of Sunnah. Jami al-Tirmizi quotes it this way: I am leaving among you 2 weighty things, the one being the Book of Allah, in which there is right guidance and light, so hold fast to the Book of Allah and adhere to it. The second are the members of my household. I remind you of your duties to the members of my family, the people of my house, for whom acceptance of zakat is forbidden, and they are Ali and the offsprings of Ali. Sunan al-Kubra describes it as, I left among you 2 treasures which, if you cling to them, you shall not be led into errors after me. One of them is greater than the other, the Book of God, which is stretched from heaven to earth, and the people of my household. Be careful of how you treat the 2 treasures after me. The history of Al-Tabari quotes, I have left you with something which, if you hold fast to it, you will never go astray. That is, the Book of God and the Sunnah of his Prophet. It should be noted that the most read book of Sunnah, Sahih Bukhari, refers to the discrepancy in the above hadith due to a dispute that occurred when the Prophet, on his deathbed, asked for a pen and paper to write his hadith. It is mentioned that there were a few people around him, and some of them disagreed to give him a pen and paper. This created a chaos that stayed until his death. It is also evident from these collections that the Quran was verbally communicated by different people till hundreds of years. This is a sufficient time even for a genuine phrase to get distorted during natural processing of information and human errors, no matter how good someone's memory may be in the chain. The verses in Part 5 provide sufficient guidelines to identify distortions in the Quran, Sunnah, and other religious writings, extrapolating how distortions were made in previous scriptures by God, to contemporary times. References: Quran translation by Ali Quli Qarai, Quran translation by Dr. Niaz Muhammad Hamadani, Balagh al-Quran by Sheikh Mohsin Najafi, Jami al-Tirmizi by Abu Isa Muhammad al-Tirmidhi, Sahih Muslim by Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj al-Naysaburi, Sahih Bukhari by Imam al-Bukhari, Ghadir Hum by Vaclieri V. in the Encyclopedia of Islam, 2nd edition, edited by Beeman, Bianquist, Bosworth, Van Donsel, and Heinrichs. The Prophet's Heir, The Life of Ali ibn Abi Talib by Abbas H. Sunan al-Kubra by Imam al-Nasai, The History of Al-Tabari, Volume 9, translated by Ismail K. Poonawala, Quran Ki Marifat by Murtada Mutahari, The Role of Reason in Ijtihad by Murtada Mutahari.